In this lecture, we want to look at women serving in ordained roles in the modern church, specifically the 20th century. Now, women have served in all kinds of ministries, all kinds of roles, as we've seen throughout this course. This is specifically roles recognized within the leadership of the church. And there's three connected questions here. One is, can a woman teach and preach? This tends to be the question in the Protestant church, which emphasizes the word. In liturgical churches like Catholic, Orthodox, and Anglican, there's a question of, can women act as priests? We'll get into that conversation a little bit. And then all Christian churches have to wrestle with the question, can women rule in the church? Can they serve as senior pastors? Can they serve as bishops? Could a woman be pope? Those are big questions. Now, we've already seen a little bit of the background here. With the Protestant Reformation, women began to take on more leadership roles. Quakers allowed women to preach beginning in the 1600s. Women like Margaret Fell. They clamped down on that ultimately, but the legacy continued among sectarian churches in the U.S. and especially among holiness churches who ordained women. Baptists also began ordaining women in the 1800s, even though they also clamped down on it by the 1900s. We'll give an example about this in a minute with Alma Bridwell White. The Episcopal Church ordained deaconesses in the 1920s, but reversed that in 1930. So here's an example of a female leader who was both a teacher, preacher, and an authority figure. Alma Bridwell White, fascinating character. She started the Pillar of Fire Church, which grew out of the holiness movement. She became the first woman ordained bishop in the U.S. in the year 1918. And when you read her story, you see how complicated reality is. So she was an advocate of women's rights. She did support feminism. But she was also associated with the Ku Klux Klan. She was a racist. She was very anti-Catholic. She was hostile to immigrants. So this is not some sort of straightforwardly progressive or liberal movement. It's kind of mixed bag. But she was really successful in one sense. In her ministry at the time of her death, she had over 4,000 followers, 61 churches, 7 schools, 10 periodicals, and 2 broadcasting stations. Now, by far the most influential woman in the early 20th century was Aimee Semple McPherson. She came out of the Pentecostal tradition, also connected with holiness movement. And what made her so effective was she got in on the early media. She set up a church in Los Angeles, right next to Hollywood. And through her appearances on film, she became one of the most famous American evangelists, a household name. She started her own denomination in 1922, the International Church of the Foursquare Gospel, and she started one of the first megachurches, the Angelus Temple. She was known for her, not only for her charismatic and dynamic leadership, but also for her works of mercy. Anthony Quinn wrote that during the Depression, the one human being that never asked you what your nationality was, what you believed in, and so forth, was Aimee Semple McPherson. All you had to do was pick up the phone and say, "I'm hungry," and within an hour, there'd be a food basket there for you. So an incredibly effective ministry. Now, part of what McPherson's leadership did was it normalized women as ministers. Even though she didn't belong to a traditional mainline church, people were beginning to see women in this role on the big screen, and that normalized it. You start to see women ordained in the mainline Protestant churches in the post-war period. So the Lutheran Church began ordaining women in 1948. The Presbyterian Church ordained Margaret Towner in 1956. That was a really big move. The Methodists began ordaining women in 1956. Harvard and the Harvard Divinity School opened their programs to women in the 1960s, and other seminaries did along that time. So here's where we stand today. Most mainline denominations ordain women. So you can see the list here. This is not just Christians, but American Baptists, Episcopals, Evangelical Lutherans, the ELCA, PC USA, the Presbyterian Church USA, UCC, Universalist, Methodist, Pentecostal, Assemblies of God, AME churches, Disciples of Christ, which is the more progressive end of the Churches of Christ, and the Christian Scientist, who does not ordain women. Well, it's the larger churches. Mormons don't ordain women. Missouri Synod Lutherans are opposed to women. The Orthodox Church, the Catholic Church, the Southern Baptist Convention, and we could add a lot of smaller churches like, well, the Churches of Christ is a mixed bag, right? There are some that do and some that don't. Here you can see the growth of clergy women in the United States in various denominations. So UU is Unitarian Universalist. In 1977, only 6% of their clergy were women. In 2017, over half, almost 60%, are women. So biggest growth there, one of the most progressive Protestant denominations. But you can see really across the board the shift upward. The taupe-colored bar is the current numbers. And just compare it to the pink. So in the course of relatively short amount of time, 40 years, there's been a huge growth. Here's another chart showing the number of women. So even though there's been a lot of growth, there's still not a lot of women in leadership. So among the main lines, that's the fourth column there, where you see the most female leadership. Still only about 30% of women are in leadership compared to 70% male. Among evangelicals, it's much smaller, about 3%. Catholic, well, we'll get to Catholicism. It's a little more complicated. So, all that said, only about 11% of congregations have a woman pastor in the U.S., so definitely the minority. Some big and important denominations do not ordain women, as I said. Catholics, Southern Baptist, Mormons, some of the biggest in the U.S. And across the globe, there are even fewer women in leadership positions as pastors or priests. There are many women in other kinds of ministerial roles, which we'll talk about in just a minute. So, in some ways, the U.S. is an outlier in Europe in its egalitarianism, its acceptance of women in church leadership. Now, that's what's actually happening. How many people are open to this? This is really interesting. This is a recent Barna survey. 79% of the people Barna surveyed, which would definitely skew evangelical, are open to a female priest or pastor. 75% of men, 84% of women would be open to this. Among evangelicals, it's almost 40%. Protestants generally 70%, Catholics 80%. So a large majority of people, generally speaking, are open to women in these positions of ecclesiastical leadership. This is a really recent article, well, 2020, from Christianity Today. Nearly 3/4 of evangelical Christians support a woman preaching during Sunday worship. And it says that this stays consistent even among biblical literalists who attend church multiple times a week. So the most conservative of this group would be open, many of them would be open to women's leadership. Now, just this summer, the Southern Baptist Convention has been wrestling with this. There are a number of Southern Baptist churches with women in leadership. It's still a small number, but it was a growing number. Saddleback, which I mentioned earlier, Rick Warren's church in California, was maybe the most notable one. It ordained women just recently. So the Southern Baptist Church wanted to restrict women in leadership positions, women as pastors. This proposal failed. Barely, but it did fail. So, for now at least, the Southern Baptist Convention does not have this language that narrows it down. Nevertheless, the Baptists remain among the evangelicals most opposed to women serving. And yet, women are serving in all kinds of positions. Part of this depends on how we define what's a pastor. Now, if you're in a Catholic church, a priest is very clearly defined, but among evangelicals, pastor can mean a lot of things. It's very squishy. So, for instance, there are a large number of women youth pastors, children's pastors, family pastors. About 23% of all of these roles are filled by women. There's a lot of associate pastors. About a fifth of Southern Baptist churches have associate pastors. Other kinds of pastors, about a fifth. Worship pastors, about 10%, are women. Co-pastors with a husband, there's a number of those. Smaller number of senior pastors and elders, some executive pastors. So you can see the numbers here. So even though the Baptist church is trying to restrict what women can do, women are still serving in all kinds of other ways. They're just having to get around that language of pastor. Now, I want to emphasize this, a lot of interest in women's leadership this past couple of years because of the Baptist. Lifeway did a big survey, a report on the state of ministry to women. You can go look this up. They reported over 1,000 evangelical and black Protestant female churchgoers and 842 women's ministry leaders in the U.S. Of these 842 women working in ministry, only 17% received any sort of payment. Only 5% of these female leaders reported planning together with the broader church staff. What does this mean? Women are doing lots of work in the church, but they don't get the title, and they don't get the pay, and they don't get their voice heard in the leadership conversations. So, a lot more women doing the unpaid work of the church than men. And we have to ask the question, is this just? Is this fair?